So the first thing to say about Aristotle's virtue ethics is that it takes a different approach to the other ethical theories we've looked at so far. So where utilitarianism and Kant try to define what good actions are, virtue ethics instead tries to define what a good person is. So it's kind of the other way around. Rather than saying a good person is one who does good actions, Aristotle says good actions are the kind of actions that would be done by a good or virtuous person. So what makes a virtuous person? Well, I'm glad you asked. So Aristotle's virtue ethics, as described in the Nicomachean Ethics, Nicomachean, however you say it, in the Ethics, involves a bunch of Greek words like Eudaimonia and Phronesis and Ergon. And sometimes people just translate them into English words, but the translations aren't perfect, so they take a bit of explanation. Probably the most important of these words today is Eudaimonia, which in my version just gets translated to happiness, but if it were that simple, we'd be doing another video on utilitarianism. Because I don't think Aristotle was talking about the kind of temporary psychological feeling of being happy. So other common translations of eudaimonia include living and faring well and human flourishing. So how I think of eudaimonia is a good life you would want for yourself. So happy in an emotional sense, yes, but also morally good and decent, successful, full of achievements, you have loving friends and family, you're not short of money, and so on. It's not any single one of these things, but it's all of them. So yeah, I think this word flourishing kind of captures what Aristotle means a bit more accurately here. It's a good life in a broad sense, the kind of good life you would want for yourself. And this isn't intended as a kind of precise definition at this stage, as Aristotle himself says. So anyway, like I mentioned in the intro, Aristotle approaches ethics from a different perspective to utilitarianism and Kant, from an agent-centered perspective rather than an action-centered perspective. So where utilitarianism and Kant would presumably define a good life as one made up of good actions, Aristotle kind of starts at the end and works backwards. He starts with this concept of eudaimonia, i.e. a good life, and then works out what's good kind of backwards from that. So eudaimonia is a good life for a human being, and Aristotle says this is a final end, something that's valuable for its own sake. You don't need to ask why a good life is good or why it should be pursued. Eudaimonia is not something we pursue as a means for something else. If you compare eudaimonia with something like money, for example, money is definitely part of eudaimonia. It wouldn't be a good life if you're constantly broke and hungry, for example, but money by itself isn't sufficient for eudaimonia because there's more to a good life than just having tons of money. The reason why money is valuable is because it's part of what makes a good life. It's part of eudaimonia. Likewise with health, the reason why exercise is good is because it helps you be healthy. And the reason why being healthy is good is because it's part of a good life. It's part of eudaimonia. And so, again, if you keep asking why something is valuable, you end up at this final end of eudaimonia. Finally, and another reason why eudaimonia is not the same thing as the psychological state of happiness, is that it's an assessment of a person's life as a whole. It's not something you can lose from one moment to the next, or even one day to the next. As Aristotle says, one swallow does not make a summer, neither does one day. Similarly, neither can one day, or a brief space of time, make a man blessed and happy. So Aristotle says that eudaimonia, i.e. flourishing or a good life, is our final end and what we're aiming for. So he then moves on the discussion to how we can achieve eudaimonia and fleshes out a bit more what this means. So the next Greek word is ergon, which my version translates as function. But again, people quibble about these definitions, so another popular translation of ergon is the characteristic activity of a thing. So for example, the ergon of a knife is to cut things. That is the activity, the function that characterizes what a knife is. Or the ergon of a sprinter is to run fast and win races. The ergon of a car is to get people from point A to point B. You get the idea. A thing's ergon is the function or activity that characterises that thing. And this idea of ergon gives us a kind of framework through which we can evaluate things. So for example, a car that's always breaking down and blowing up is not a good car because it isn't performing its function well. It isn't getting people reliably from point A to point B. Likewise, a knife that's totally blunt and, can't even cut through a stick of butter, that's not a good knife because it's not performing its function well. In contrast, a knife that can cut through a tough steak with ease, that's a good knife because it's performing its function well. So a thing is good to the extent it performs its function, to the extent which it fulfills its ergon. And virtues, as in virtue ethics, are traits of things that enable them to perform their function well. So, with the example of a knife, sharpness is a virtue of a knife because sharpness helps the knife perform its function of cutting things. Likewise with the car, reliability and speed and comfort, these are all virtues of a car because they enable the car to perform its function, fulfill its ergon of transporting people safely and reliably from point A to point B. Or a sprinter has the virtue of speed because speed enables the sprinter to win races. A snail wouldn't make a good sprinter because it doesn't have this virtue. Anyway, the point of all these examples is to illustrate Aristotle's kind of teleological worldview. Everything has an ergon or a function, and virtues are traits that enable the thing to perform this ergon or function well. And this worldview extends also to human beings. So if the ergon of a knife is to cut things, what is the ergon of a human being? What's the unique function that characterises a human? Well, it's not to cut things because that's a knife's job. It's not simply life either because that function wouldn't differentiate a human's character from that of a plant or a vegetable. So we might specify a kind of sentient life, but this would also cover animals, and we want the function that is unique to humans. The answer Aristotle arrives at is the use of reason. It is this function that differentiates a human being from a knife, a plant, all these other things. The use of reason is the unique characteristic of a human being. But Aristotle doesn't mean kind of just sitting around reading books and theorising. He means the unique. More specifically, he says to act according to reason. Aristotle doesn't think the function of a human is to just sit around kind of pontificating and reading books and theorising. So the ergon of humans, their unique characteristic activity, is to use reason and act rightly according to reason. So again, Aristotle has this kind of teleological worldview. Everything has a function or an ergon, and virtues are traits that enable a thing to fulfill that ergon. A knife's ergon is to cut things, and the ergon of a human being is to act according to reason. And just as the virtue or arete of sharpness enables the knife to perform its function well, human beings also can have virtues, character traits that enable them to act rightly according to reason. So virtues are traits that enable a thing to perform its function. And in the case of human beings, virtues are character traits that enable a human being to act correctly according to reason. It's important to emphasise that virtues are character traits. So if a person has a friendly character, but one day they're having a bit of an off day and they act rudely, that doesn't mean they're no longer a friendly person. So again, one swallow doesn't make a summer, and so it takes more than a single bad day to change a person's character. So virtues, virtue ethics, these are character traits like being courageous, being friendly, having self-control, for example. And these are character traits that enable us to act rightly, act in the right way. And Aristotle says these character traits are always the midpoint between two vices, a vice of excess and a vice of deficiency. So vices are like the opposite of virtues, they are negative character traits. So if you lack courage, for example, you're deficient in it, then you're cowardly. And cowardice is a vice of deficiency. Sometimes you've got to stand up for yourself and maybe fight people or whatever. But if you go too far the other way...
Problem was, he'd taken so many beatings on the terraces that he weren't scared of anyone. And the correct medical term for that is a total psycho.
Let's get out of here. There's about 10 Stoke fans staring at us.
How many of them did you say there was?
About 10. Please don't start, Bill.
Right, which one of them staring at me?
Then that goes beyond courage into kind of recklessness or rashness. And that's not a virtue either. That's a vice of excess. So the virtue of courage is in between these two vices. It's in between the vice of deficiency, i.e. cowardice, and the vice of excess, i.e. kind of recklessness or foolhardiness. Or self-control or temperance is, I think, the classic word for this. So if you're kind of a slave to your desires and you know, just eating food all day and doing drugs and scrolling social media and playing video games and that's all you ever do, then you're lacking in self-control. You're licentious. That's the word. But you can go too far the other way. You know, those kind of people who are just so strict with themselves and they can't ever let their hair down or have a bit of fun. You know, they're at home, can't come to the party because they're too busy prepping their meals for the week or whatever. Like, again, that goes beyond self-control into a kind of self-denial. So that could be an excess of self-control, and that's a vice as well. So again, the virtue of temperance or self-control is in between the vices of self-denial and, what's the other one? Licentiousness. Anyway, I'll put some other examples up on the screen, but again, the virtue is in between the vice of excess and the vice of deficiency. But one other thing to just mention quickly, what exactly the virtue looks like is going to differ from person to person and situation to situation. So for example, being funny is a virtue, but what exactly the appropriate amount of humour looks like is going to be very different for, say, a funeral director versus a stand-up comedian. You know, if the funeral director is kind of constantly cracking jokes, then...
I don't want you to judge me, ladies and gentlemen, but when my nana died, we went bowling. Life goes on. Not hers, obviously. She was in a box on fire.
Then that's probably a vice of excess. But for a stand-up comedian, for example, what the mean looks like is going to be different to the funeral director. So that's just another thing to bear in mind. Another thing to touch on here is the role of emotions. When you hear me say that Aristotle says the function of human beings is to use reason, you might think I'm saying that Aristotle says the function of human beings is to kind of act purely using logic and never feeling emotions, a bit like perhaps Kant, if you remember from the last video. But this isn't what Aristotle has in mind. So the virtuous person should feel emotions, but in the right way, at the right time, and so on. So you should feel sad at the death of a loved one, for example, or joy at the birth of a child. So the function of humans is to use reason, yes, but we can use our reason to kind of direct our emotional responses so that we feel the correct emotions at the right time and place and so on. So I'll give you some examples to illustrate what I think Aristotle means by this. So when you're a kid, for example, you might hate eating vegetables and just want to eat sweets or whatever. But your parents, who are the voice of reason at that age, they encourage you to eat healthily. And eventually, over time, you begin to enjoy eating healthily. So your taste and your emotional reaction changes, and the thought of eating nothing but sweets might now actually make you feel sick. Or reading, for example. I think this is true of a lot of people nowadays, myself included. So reading is kind of maybe a bit boring and difficult if you're not in the habit of it. Like, you have to kind of force yourself to do it a bit, especially if you're addicted to screens and have a lower attention span or whatever. But once reading becomes a habit and you get used to it, it can actually be really enjoyable. So again, you can kind of use your reason to shape your tastes and desires and emotional responses. So yeah, it's the same thing with virtues. You develop courageous character, for example, by acting courageously. And so if you act courageously, even if it doesn't come naturally at first, then the next time you're in a similar situation, it becomes easier to act courageously because you've done it before. And if you keep acting courageously until it becomes part of your character, it becomes habit, then you might actually begin to enjoy acting courageously. You might enjoy pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. So again, like the reading and eating vegetables examples, you can kind of change your emotional response through habit. And I could run a similar story with the other virtues like temperance or honesty or kindness, but I think you get the idea. The point is that by acting virtuously, it becomes habit, it becomes part of your character. And over time, through these habits, you then begin to enjoy acting virtuously. And while we're on this point, Aristotle says that acquiring virtues is a bit like acquiring skills. You can't learn to ride a bike, for example, by just studying the theory and reading books about bikes. You have to actually practice riding the bike until you're able to do it. And again, it's the same with virtue. You can't develop virtuous character by just reading Aristotle or theorizing about virtue. You have to actually go out into the world and act virtuously until it becomes habit and part of your character. So anyway, to summarize the theory before we move on to some objections. The function or ergon of human beings is to act according to reason, and virtues are character traits that dispose us to fulfill this ergon and act according to our function. And if you act well over the course of a lifetime, you'll have a good life, i.e. you'll achieve eudaimonia. So the first potential issue for Aristotle's virtue ethics I want to talk about today is that the definitions may appear circular. So as an agent-centered theory, Aristotle characterizes the good or virtuous course of action as the course of action a virtuous person would take. And then you might say, well, Aristotle characterizes a virtuous person as the kind of person who does good or virtuous acts. But this isn't a very helpful definition because it kind of contains the original term we set out to define. If a virtuous person is one who does virtuous acts, and virtuous acts are the kind of acts done by virtuous people, then that's not helpful as a definition because it's circular. It doesn't actually tell us anything about what virtue is. So Aristotle could potentially respond to this objection by clarifying the theory. I don't want to rehash it all again here, but if you remember, Aristotle says that a virtuous person is one who possesses character traits, virtues like courage and kindness and so on, and that these character traits are character traits that enable them to live a good life, to flourish, to fulfill their function, to act according to reason and achieve eudaimonia. And so the response could be that rather than defining virtuous people in terms of virtuous acts, it's a bit more complicated than that. That a virtuous person is instead defined in terms of eudaimonia and flourishing. So rather than being circular, you could think of the definitions as linear. Virtuous acts are those done by virtuous people, and virtuous people are those who act according to good reason and achieve eudaimonia. So there you go, on to the next objection. So as we saw earlier, there's all sorts of different virtues. So you've got courage, kindness, temperance, and so on. And so what do you do if you find yourself in a situation where one virtue appears to demand one course of action and a different virtue appears to demand a completely different or contradictory course of action? What do you do if you find yourself in a situation where you have competing virtues? So for example, let's say your friend is, rocking up in some really wacky outfit and he asks you what you think. Well, you might say that the virtue of sincerity or honesty demands you tell the truth, whereas the virtue of kindness or compassion demands you say, you look great. Or you're the judge, and before you in court today is somebody guilty of stealing a loaf of bread. Well, you might say that the virtue of justice demands you send this thief to jail for their horrible crime, whereas the virtue of compassion or kindness, maybe mercy, demands that you let the thief go. And so, again, in both these scenarios, you can't do both actions. You can't both tell the truth and tell your friend he looks great, for example. You can't send the thief to jail and let him go. And so Aristotle's in a bit of a bind here, because it seems that virtue ethics is impossible to follow in practice. So there's a couple of ways the defender of virtue ethics might respond to this competing virtues objection. The first way is to propose a kind of hierarchy of virtues. And I think Aristotle himself does this somewhere, and he puts justice at the top of this hierarchy. So that would solve the judge example, although I don't know how that solves the, wacky clothes example. But anyway, the second way we might resolve the conflicting virtues objection is to appeal to another one of these Greek words, phronesis. And this translates to practical wisdom. And I suppose there's a bit of an analogy between practical wisdom and practical skills like plumbing, for example, because each bathroom is different. It's got different fittings and different layout and so on. And so a plumber has to use their kind of general experience from a bunch of other bathrooms and then apply it to the specific details of this particular bathroom. Likewise with phronesis or practical wisdom is the ability to have a general conception of what's good, of eudaimonia, and then apply it to the specific details of the situation. So phronesis is an intellectual virtue. It's something you have to think about and reflect on, because you could have the other virtues we've discussed so far, such as courage, kindness, honesty, or whatever. You could have these virtues almost accidentally. So, if you're born kind of genetically courageous, let's say, then you might act courageously, you might act virtuously, but you might not understand why what you're doing is good. You're just acting virtuously almost automatically. Whereas the properly virtuous person, the person with a practical wisdom, is able to understand why courage is a virtue and is able to choose to act virtuously because it's a virtue, not just because, they're naturally courageous, for example. Anyway, I bring this up because you could argue that resolving these apparent conflicts between virtues requires phronesis. It requires practical wisdom. So if you think being sincere means you have to tell the truth in every situation, then you probably lack the practical wisdom to understand that each situation is different. I mean, just look at my favourite, Jim Carrey in Liar Liar, for example.
Is it good for you?
I've had better.
Is telling the truth 100% of the time really the virtuous way to act? Or the judge example. We'd have to flesh out the situation a bit more. Like, is the thief an arrogant billionaire who stole the bread just to spite the shop owner? Or was the thief kind of down on his luck and only stole the bread to avoid starving to death? What justice looks like is going to differ massively depending on these details. And having phronesis means having the practical wisdom to grasp these details, to think them through in the concept of this broader concept of eudaimonia and what's good, and then act accordingly. So for example, the virtuous judge might still send the down on his luck thief to jail, but perhaps give him a lower sentence compared to the billionaire thief. Again, virtue ethics is not like Kant's deontological ethics from the last video. There aren't any kind of absolute abstract rules that can never be broken. Instead, it's all about the details of the situation, because each situation is different. And having practical wisdom means being able to appreciate these details and act virtuously to balance the different virtues in light of these details. Basically, this response says that on a proper understanding of virtue ethics, a true conflict between virtues is impossible. If you think there's a conflict between virtues, if you think one virtue demands you act one way and a different virtue demands you act a different way, then that's just because you lack the practical wisdom to appreciate the details of the situation. The next potential issue for virtue ethics I want to talk about today kind of questions these links between eudaimonia virtue and what's morally good. So if you remember, Aristotle defines virtues in terms of character traits that contribute to eudaimonia, that contribute to a good life for ourselves and flourishing. But can we think of examples of traits that are virtues but don't necessarily contribute to a good life? So for example, imagine a selfless and compassionate doctor who dedicates her entire life to treating and curing disease in some far-flung corner of the globe. It's difficult and dangerous work, which she finds stressful, but her compassionate and selfless nature motivates her to keep going for the sake of the people whose lives she's saving. She's so dedicated to the cause that she has little time for anything else. No time for friends, family, money, or her own happiness. Eventually, the nature of her work becomes too much for her, and she dies at, let's say, age 30 from disease and stress. So if virtues are to be understood as character traits that contribute to eudaimonia, then it seems you have to say the nurse's compassion and care for other people aren't virtues at all. After all, they didn't contribute to her flourishing and living a good life. But this seems kind of wrong. Of course compassion and care are virtues, but since compassion and care don't contribute to a good life for yourself, it seems Aristotle would have to say that compassion and care aren't virtues at all. You could push this example further perhaps and argue that if virtues are to be defined as character traits that contribute towards eudaimonia, then really the real virtues are being selfish and self-interested. Because after all, these traits are probably more likely to lead to your own personal flourishing. What these examples are supposed to show is that something can be a virtue, like the doctor's compassion, and not contribute to eudaimonia, or to make the objection the other way around, that there might be examples of vices like selfishness that do contribute to eudaimonia. In other words, we might reject Aristotle's characterization of virtues in terms of character traits that contribute to eudaimonia, and instead argue that our real final end is instead some kind of broader societal conception of flourishing, rather than simply a good life for ourselves. So one way virtue ethics can respond to this objection is to argue that this objection kind of gets it the wrong way round. That rather than starting with eudaimonia and working out what virtues are from that, a proper understanding of virtue ethics instead works the other way round. And this is the approach that Julia Annas argues for in a nice and concise, which I always like, overview of virtue ethics. Anyway, in this overview, she says, classical virtue theories reject the idea that flourishing can be specified right at the start. Rather, virtue ethics tells us that a life lived in accordance with virtues is the best specification of what flourishing is. So in other words, rather than starting with this preconceived notion of eudaimonia and then working out what the virtues are backwards from that, Annas says that a proper understanding of virtue ethics starts with the virtues. It starts with traits like compassion, kindness, and courage and so on, and then works out what eudaimonia is from these virtues. And maybe this way round makes more sense, because if we started with this selfish notion of eudaimonia, where our final end was simply our own flourishing, then we'd miss out on a bunch of things that make a good life. For example, if the only value you saw in other people was as a means to your own flourishing, then you could never have genuine friendships, because the whole point of friendship is that you actually care about the other person. Or if the only reason you care about your wife is because she contributes to your own happiness, but you don't value hers, then that's not a good relationship. And so if you start with this selfish notion of flourishing, then you'll miss out on a bunch of aspects that make life good, and you'll kind of paradoxically end up not flourishing. But if we start with the virtues, this gives a broader and more complete picture of eudaimonia, where we're invested in the flourishing of other people. However, if we take this kind of wider societal conception of eudaimonia to its logical conclusion, we end up with kind of issues in the other direction. So, returning to our selfless doctor example, it seems a bit of a stretch to say this is what Aristotle had in mind when he was talking about eudaimonia. It seems a bit of a stretch to say our selfless doctor flourished, that she had a good life. After all, she was constantly stressed and unhappy, despite the fact that she was morally good and spent her life helping others out of compassion and care. So although I don't think Aristotle had this kind of entirely selfish conception of eudaimonia in mind, I don't think he would say the selfless doctor flourished either. So yeah, a good life, i.e. eudaimonia, does involve some degree of commitment to other people, but it also does include some level of personal success, some degree of happiness, having good friends and family and so on. And since our selfless doctor lacked these elements, we probably wouldn't want to say she achieved eudaimonia. But I think few people would disagree that our example of the selfless doctor, that she was a morally good person. After all, she spent her entire life helping other people and died for the cause of doing so. That is a very morally admirable person, even if it's not a life we would want for ourselves. And so this raises a different potential criticism of virtue ethics. The criticism of virtue ethics as an account of what's morally good. So again, if you think about it in terms of Venn diagrams, the Venn diagram of eudaimonia and the Venn diagram of a morally good life, these two circles don't overlap perfectly. That you can be a morally good person and not achieve eudaimonia. And so if you can be a morally good person and not achieve eudaimonia, then eudaimonia is not a good definition of what's morally good. The two circles come apart. And since this is moral philosophy where we're trying to define what's morally good, this is kind of a big issue for the theory. But maybe this is a bit of an unfair criticism when I don't think Aristotle was kind of trying to answer this narrower question of what a morally good life is. And maybe Aristotle's approach is a bit more healthy here, because although the selfless doctor is an example of a morally good life, it probably wouldn't be ideal if everybody's lives were like that. I don't think that would be flourishing. And so I guess the upshot of this discussion, as always with virtue ethics, is that either extreme is bad. Eudaimonia requires some degree of commitment to others. You can't flourish if you're entirely selfish, but if you go too far the other way, that's not flourishing either. You end up like the selfless doctor. So to borrow some vocabulary from the definitions of knowledge video, commitment to others is necessary, but not sufficient for eudaimonia. The final issue I want to talk about with virtue ethics today is that it doesn't provide clear guidance. It doesn't actually tell you what you should and shouldn't do. So if you're in a genuine moral dilemma, like the trolley problem for example, where pulling a switch means killing one person but saving the lives of 3 others, it's not helpful to say, well, just do what a virtuous person would do, because that's exactly what we want to know. We're back at the circularity problem. Or to say, go with the mean and avoid vices of excess and vices of deficiency, not too much or too little. That's not much help either, because too much and too little aren't actually quantifiable amounts. And even if you could pin down the mean, you've then got to contend with competing virtues again. So maybe compassion demands you pull the switch, but justice demands you don't. The other ethical theories we've looked at, utilitarianism and Kant's deontological ethics, provide clear answers to these moral dilemmas. They provide a clear answer to the trolley problem, for example. So Kant's deontological ethics would say, don't pull the switch, because killing people is wrong, that we have a duty not to kill other people. Whereas Bentham's utilitarianism and the utility calculus would presumably say to pull the switch, because all else being equal, 3 is greater than 1, and so it results in a greater amount of happiness or pleasure to kill one person, to sacrifice one person, if it means saving the lives and pleasure of these 3 people. So whatever other faults these theories have, at least utilitarianism and Kant provide clear guidance. Whereas Aristotle's instruction to, do the right thing at the right time towards the right people, to follow the golden mean, this doesn't actually tell you what to do in a genuine moral dilemma like the trolley problem. Even Aristotle himself admits this. He says, for this reason it is a difficult business to be good, because in any given case it is difficult to find the midpoint. For instance, not everyone can find the centre of a circle, only the man who knows how. So too it is easy to get angry, anyone can do that, or to give and spend money, but to feel or act towards the right person to the right extent at the right time for the right reason is the right way. That is not easy, and it's not everyone that can do it. So yeah, maybe this criticism does hit the target. Even Aristotle himself admits as much. But, and this is kind of Aristotle's whole point, is that we can't provide simple instructions, simple black and white rules that tell us what we should and shouldn't do, because real life is complicated. Real life is shades of grey. You know, the joke at the funeral is very different from the joke down the pub with your friends, for example. Or the same act of stealing is very different if it's done out of malice than when it's done to avoid starvation. The white lie you tell your pregnant wife,
"Honey, you look great. You're beautiful. You're glowing." If I'd have told Mommy she looked like a cow, it would have hurt her feelings. Understand?
is very different from the lie a con artist tells old people in order to scam them out of their pensions. And if you do try to come up with these one-size-fits-all rules, you end up with all these crazy conclusions. For example, we saw how in the last video, Kant says you can't even tell a simple lie in order to save everybody on planet Earth, which seems ridiculous. And also in the utilitarianism video, we saw how boiling everything down to consequences means ignoring concepts of justice and rights. You can torture an innocent baby, for example, if enough, sick people would get pleasure from it. And so neither of these kind of black and white approaches stand up to the various edge cases and the complexities of real life. So the reason why virtue ethics doesn't provide clear guidance or black and white rules is because no such guidance is even possible. Real life is complicated. It takes experience to develop the practical wisdom to understand what's good and then apply it to the details of each particular situation. And each situation is different. But even with all that said, it's not like Aristotle's theory provides no guidance whatsoever. We can still ask ourselves, what would a courageous person do? Or how could I exercise more self-control? What would a virtuous person do? Or we could look at other virtuous people and use them as role models, for example. And what's more, towards the end of book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle provides a few kind of practical tips, 3 top tips for virtue. So the first tip is, rather than aiming for the mean, we should instead just try to aim to stay away from excess. Because although we might not be able to identify what the perfect amount of self-control is, for example, we can still identify, for example, when somebody is being too licentious, for example. If you're just scoffing pies and doing drugs all day, maybe try to do less of that rather than worry about whether you're exercising the perfect amount of self-control. Or similarly, we can all recognize somebody who's cowardly or reckless, even if we can't perfectly recognize what the perfect amount of courage looks like. So again, the first tip is to stay away from the excesses, to try to stay away from the excesses rather than aim at the mean. Aristotle's next top tip for virtue is kind of related. He points out how we all have natural inclinations towards some vices more than others. So for example, some people are just, genetically more inclined to work hard, for example, and others are genetically lazy, let's say. So if you're one of the genetically lazy people, let's say, Aristotle says you should recognize that about yourself and then aim, work extra hard to pull yourself away from this vice of laziness towards the virtue, that we need to know ourselves and recognize which vices we're inclined to fall into and then try to make a concerted effort to kind of pull ourselves away from these vices. So Aristotle's third and final top tip for virtue is to avoid using pleasure as a guide to what's good. And he uses the example of Helen of Troy, which is a myth I'm not too familiar with, but I don't know why. She was bad for the society. She was too good looking, basically. And so the Trojan elders sent her away from Troy back to Greece, because even though you might want to spend all day, looking at Helen of Troy, there's more important things to do. So they sent her back to Greece. Anyway, I think Aristotle's point is like, McDonald's might be very pleasurable, but it's not necessarily a good thing to sit around eating fast food all day. Or heroin probably feels quite pleasurable, but that doesn't mean it's good. So Aristotle's advice here is that we should do the same as the Trojan elders, that we should not use pleasure as a guide to what's good. We should instead use reason to decide what's good and then pursue that. And yeah, this is all kind of basic common sense advice, but does it provide clear guidance in a genuine moral dilemma? I don't know. So to summarise Aristotle's virtue ethics, the book, although maybe not the theory, starts with this concept of eudaimonia. So eudaimonia is the good life for a human being. And the good life for a human being must be something unique to a human being. So Aristotle argues that everything has a unique function, or ergon. The ergon of a knife, for example, is to cut things. For Aristotle, if something's good, it fulfills its function. So a good knife is one that cuts things, for example. And so, by analogy, a good life for a human being must consist of one where the human being fulfills its purpose, fulfills its ergon. So the ergon of human beings, the unique activity that characterises a human being and differentiates it from a knife or a plant or an animal or anything else in the world, is reason, says Aristotle. Human beings are rational animals, and reason is the unique characteristic of a human. And so the good life for a human, i.e. eudaimonia, is one that's in alignment with its function, a life full of actions chosen according to reason. And this is where virtues come in. So in the same way the virtue of sharpness helps the knife fulfill its ergon, virtues are character traits that enable a human being to fulfill their ergon. In other words, virtues are character traits that enable a human to choose correctly and live a good life. So these are things like courage or kindness or humour or self-control. And these virtues are the mean or midpoint between a vice of deficiency and a vice of excess. So for example, courage, the virtue, is in between the vice of deficiency of cowardice and the vice of excess of recklessness or rashness. So virtues are developed through habit and training, a bit like skills. You don't get strong by sitting at home all day, for example, you have to go out and lift weights. Likewise, you don't get courageous by staying home and thinking about it or reading books. You have to actually put yourself in situations where you need to act courageously. And by doing this continually over time, it eventually becomes habit, it becomes part of your nature. Your natural inclination becomes to act courageously, and what's more, because this is your nature, you get enjoyment and happiness from acting courageously, and enjoyment from being virtuous. And so ultimately, by cultivating virtuous character, we act well, and acting well leads to flourishing. So we're back at this concept of eudaimonia. We also looked at a few issues for virtue ethics, like how you can live a morally good life, but not necessarily achieve eudaimonia. But perhaps the most common critiques of Aristotle's virtue ethics around the fact that it doesn't provide clear guidance. So we looked at, for example, the criticism that Aristotle's ethics is circular, that virtuous acts are defined in terms of virtuous people, and virtuous people are potentially defined in terms of virtuous acts. And we also looked at the issue of how it doesn't really provide any clear instructions or guidance. So where utilitarianism and Kant's deontological ethics give you kind of clear yes or no answers on what you should do, Aristotle's instruction to act in the right way at the right time towards the right people is not the most helpful if you're in a genuine moral dilemma. But then also the flip side of this kind of no clear guidance, vague criticism is that it avoids some of the pitfalls of these other theories. This same vagueness gives it a kind of flexibility to avoid, for example, the scenario where Kant can't even tell a lie to save everyone on Earth, or utilitarianism is torturing people for the pleasure of a large crowd who'd enjoy seeing that. It's always a bit of a weird one comparing Aristotle with these other ethical theories, because in some ways they're answering the same question of what is morally good, but in another way, Aristotle's kind of answering a different question altogether. Not only that, there's a ton of context that goes into the theory. You've got these ancient Greek words that don't translate perfectly, so Aristotle's theory is kind of embedded in the context of the time, and also the context of his wider theory, which I didn't go into today. Next time we're moving on from these normative ethical theories onto the meta-ethical discussion. So rather than taking the concepts of good and bad for granted and then trying to define them, as we have done with utilitarianism, Kant, and today Aristotle's virtue ethics, this discussion instead looks at what the concepts of good and bad actually are, and also looks at what we mean when we make moral judgments such as stealing is wrong. So that's it for Aristotle's virtue ethics. I hope you enjoyed it. All that remains is the books. So as always, you can get my book. It is a very, and I mean very brief overview of this topic. Basically covers the same points we went over today. So if you're looking for further reading and a bit more detail, I'll link the Julia Annas paper that I mentioned earlier down below, which is a really, like I said, a nice and concise overview of virtue ethics. I'll also link the Stanford page. Haven't read it, but they're all peer reviewed and therefore infallible. And then as for primary sources, I think Aristotle wrote maybe 3 ethical treatises, however you say it. The Eudaimonia ethics and another one of dubious origin. But yeah, no one's ever read those. The one everybody reads and the one this video was based around is the Nicomachean ethics, however you say it. And yeah, this book really gets a thumbs up from me. It is, unlike most primary ethical theories, like reading Kant's grounding for the metaphysics of morals is hardly a page turner, but the Nicomachean ethics reads like it almost reads like a self-help book. It is very practical, very relatable, even though it was written more than 2,000 years ago. So the Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics gets a I'm going to give it 2 thumbs up actually. It's that good. And yeah, I think Aristotle was probably one of the smartest people ever to have lived. I actually just wrote a short sort of biography of Aristotle for my website, so I'll also link that down below, because he wrote, it wasn't just ethics, he basically invented logic and laid the groundwork for a lot of modern day science, so Aristotle gets a thumbs up as well. But yeah, that about does it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one.